I'm sitting here at 2 a.m., wine glass empty, wondering how someone can love you for 4 years and then act like you never existed. But maybe I should start from the beginning, because this mess didn't happen overnight, and honestly, I'm still trying to figure out where everything went sideways. My name is Charlotte. I'm 31, and until recently I thought I had my life figured out. I work in marketing for a mid-sized tech company, have my own apartment in a decent neighborhood, and I've always prided myself on being the kind of woman who doesn't need anyone to complete her. Independence has always been my thing, maybe to a fault. Ben and I met 4 years ago at a mutual friend's house. He was this quiet, thoughtful guy who worked as a systems analyst, the kind of person who listened more than he talked and seemed genuinely interested in what you had to say. While everyone else was getting loud and sloppy, we ended up in the host's backyard, having this amazing conversation about everything from travel dreams to childhood fears. He had this way of asking follow-up questions that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. I was drawn to how steady he seemed. After a string of relationships with guys who were either commitment-phobic or drama magnets, Ben felt like a breath of fresh air. He was reliable without being boring, ambitious without being ruthless, and he had this dry sense of humor that caught me off guard in the best way. Our relationship developed naturally. We'd meet for dinner after work, spend lazy Sunday mornings reading different sections of the newspaper, take weekend trips to small towns neither of us had ever visited. Ben introduced me to hiking, something I'd never thought I'd enjoy, and I got him hooked on foreign films. We complemented each other well, or at least I thought we did. The first couple of years were genuinely good. We moved in together after 18 months, splitting a 2-bedroom place that felt like the right step forward. Ben was the kind of partner who remembered your important meetings and brought you soup when you were sick. He never made me feel like I had to choose between him and my career or my friendships. We had our separate interests and our shared ones, and it felt healthy. But somewhere around year 3, things started shifting in ways that were so subtle I didn't recognize them as problems at first. Ben began making these small comments about my work schedule, nothing accusatory, just observations about how many late nights I was pulling or weekend events I was attending. Marketing is a relationship-heavy field. You're always networking, always building connections, always on. Ben's job was more predictable, structured around regular hours and clear boundaries. "Seems like you're busier than usual lately," he'd say when I'd come home from a client dinner at 9 p.m. Or another work happy hour, when I'd mention grabbing drinks with colleagues on Friday. Again, nothing that screamed red flag, but there was this undertone I couldn't quite name. The shift accelerated after I got promoted to senior account manager last spring. Suddenly, I was traveling more, attending industry conferences, managing bigger clients with more demanding schedules. I was excited about the opportunities, the increased responsibility, the validation that my hard work was paying off. But Ben seemed less enthusiastic about my success than I'd expected. The promotion came with a corner office and a salary bump that finally put me where I'd dreamed of being financially. I remember the day I got the news, rushing home to tell Ben, expecting him to suggest we celebrate with dinner at that expensive Italian place we'd been saving for special occasions. Instead, he'd listened to my excited recap of the meeting with my boss, nodded appropriately, and then asked, "So what does this mean for your schedule?" It wasn't the response I'd hoped for, but I told myself he was just being practical, thinking through the logistics like he always did. What I didn't realize at the time was that Ben had been having his own career struggles. His company had been going through layoffs, and while his position was secure, he'd watched several colleagues get let go over the past year. The stability I'd always admired in his work situation was feeling less stable, and my rising success seemed to highlight his stagnation in ways that were hard for him to articulate. He never said any of this directly, but I started noticing how he'd change the subject when I talked about work victories, or how he'd make subtle comments about corporate ladder climbers when we'd watch movies about ambitious business people. Around the same time, Ben started suggesting we spend more time with his family. His parents lived about 2 hours away, And suddenly, every other weekend, he wanted to drive up for Sunday dinner or help his dad with some home improvement project. I liked his parents well enough, but these visits always seemed to happen right when I had networking events or industry meetups I wanted to attend. "Can't you skip just one conference mixer?" he'd ask, and I'd feel guilty for prioritizing work connections over family time. But building relationships in my field required consistency, showing up regularly, being someone people remembered and wanted to work with. I started to notice that Ben had opinions about my colleagues that he'd never expressed before. When I'd mention grabbing drinks with Sarah from Creative, he'd remind me how she'd made that inappropriate comment at the company Christmas party. When I'd talk about the brilliant strategy Marcus from Digital had pitched, Ben would point out how Marcus seemed a little too interested in getting my opinion on things. It felt like he was cataloging reasons I should distance myself from the people who were becoming important to my professional growth. The worst part was that I began editing myself around him. I'd downplay exciting projects so he wouldn't feel bad about his own work situation. I'd skip mentioning industry events until the last minute, hoping to avoid the conversation about whether I really needed to go. I started feeling guilty about my ambition, like wanting more for my career was somehow a betrayal of our relationship. This created a distance between us that I couldn't name at the time. I was protecting him from my enthusiasm, but that meant I was also protecting myself from his judgment. "I feel like I barely see you anymore," he said one evening after I'd gotten home from a 3-day conference in Chicago. We were sitting on the couch, him watching TV while I scrolled through emails I'd missed. "It's temporary," I told him. "Once I get settled into the new role, things will calm down." But that wasn't entirely true, and we both knew it. The new position came with new expectations, new opportunities, new demands on my time and energy. I was building something, creating a career I could be proud of, and I needed Ben to understand that. Instead, he started asking more questions about my schedule, my travel, my colleagues. Nothing overtly controlling, but there was this undercurrent of anxiety that made me feel defensive. When I'd mention a male colleague by name, Ben would ask follow-up questions about him. When I'd come home later than expected, Ben would want a detailed recap of my evening. "I'm not checking up on you," he'd say when I'd point out his increased interest in my whereabouts. "I just miss you. I want to feel connected to your life." Part of me understood where he was coming from. My schedule had become less predictable, and I was definitely more distracted when we were together. But another part of me felt suffocated by his need for constant updates and reassurance. I'd been taking care of myself for 27 years before I met Ben, and suddenly, I felt like I had to justify my every move. The tension came to a head on a Tuesday night. I'd had back-to-back client calls that ran late, followed by a dinner meeting with a potential new account. By the time I got home, it was almost 10 p.m., and Ben was sitting at our dining table with his laptop closed, clearly waiting for me. "How was your day?" he asked, and something about his tone made me immediately defensive. "Long," I said, heading straight for the kitchen. "I need to eat something, and then I have about an hour of prep work for tomorrow's presentation." "We haven't had a real conversation in days, Charlotte." He was right, but his timing felt accusatory. "I know, and I'm sorry. Things are just intense right now with the Morrison account. Once we land this deal, I'll have more breathing room." "You said that about the Henderson project 2 months ago, and the Reynolds campaign before that." I turned to face him, already feeling that familiar spike of irritation. "What do you want me to say, Ben? This is my job, this is my career." "I thought you supported that." "I do support it, but I also need to feel like I matter in your life." "Of course you matter. Why would you even say that?" Ben stood up, running his hands through his hair in that way he did when he was frustrated. "Because I feel like I'm competing with your work for your attention, and I'm losing." "That's not fair." "Isn't it? When was the last time we had dinner together? When did we last spend a weekend doing something that wasn't related to your job?" I wanted to argue with him, to point out all the ways he was being unreasonable, but the truth was I couldn't immediately answer his questions. The Morrison account had been consuming my thoughts for weeks, and I'd been bringing that stress home without realizing it. "Look," I said, trying to soften my tone. "I know I've been distracted lately, but this is important to me. Building my career is important to me. I need you to understand that." "I do understand it, but I need you to understand that I'm important too." "We're important." Something about the way he said "we" made me feel trapped. Like I was supposed to make decisions based on what was good for us instead of what was good for me. Like my individual goals were somehow selfish. "I'm not trying to neglect you," I said. "But I'm also not going to apologize for working hard or being ambitious." "I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to make space for this relationship." "What do you think I'm doing? I live with you. I come home to you every night." You come home exhausted and distracted and barely present," Ben interrupted. "Living in the same space isn't the same as being in a relationship." That stung because it was partially true. I had been distracted, but not intentionally. Work had been demanding, and I was trying to prove myself in a new role. Didn't he understand the pressure I was under? "So what do you want from me?" I asked. "Do you want me to quit my job, turn down opportunities, become some version of myself that puts your comfort above my ambitions?" "I want you to want to spend time with me. I want to feel like I'm not just something you fit in between work commitments." We stared at each other across our dining room, and I could feel something fundamental shifting between us. This wasn't just about my work schedule. This was about what we expected from each other, what we were willing to sacrifice, what we needed to feel loved and valued. "I think," I said carefully, "I need some time to think about what you're saying." Ben's expression changed, became more alert. "What does that mean?" "It means I need space to process this conversation without feeling pressured to have all the answers right now. Charlotte, we can't just table this. We need to figure out how to move forward." But I was already mentally checking out of the conversation. I felt cornered, criticized, and exhausted by the idea that I needed to defend my career choices to someone who was supposed to be my partner. "I'm going to stay at my sister's for a few days," I said. "I need to think." "A few days? Charlotte, we're not talking about a few days' worth of problems here." "Then maybe we need more than a few days to figure things out." I packed a bag that night while Ben sat on our bed, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. How long would I be gone? What was I hoping to accomplish? Did I want to break up? "I don't know," I kept saying. "I just need time to think without feeling like I have to justify everything to you." My sister Kelly lives alone in a one-bedroom apartment across town. She's 2 years younger than me, but has always been the more traditionally minded of the two of us. She got married at 25, divorced at 28, and now spends her time warning me about the pitfalls of prioritizing career over relationships. "So Ben finally called you on your workaholic tendencies," she said over coffee the morning after I showed up at her door. "He didn't call me on anything. He's being needy and controlling." Kelly raised her eyebrows but didn't argue. She made up her couch for me and gave me space to decompress, which I appreciated. For the first few days, it felt good to not have to account for my schedule to anyone. I could work late without explaining myself, grab dinner with colleagues without checking in, focus on my projects without someone waiting at home with unmet emotional needs. Ben texted me every day for the first week. Nothing dramatic or demanding, just simple check-ins. "Hope you're doing okay. Missing you. Would love to talk when you're ready." I read the messages but didn't respond. I wasn't trying to punish him exactly, but I also wasn't ready to have the conversation he wanted. I needed time to figure out what I actually wanted from our relationship and whether his expectations were reasonable or suffocating. The second week, his messages became less frequent but more direct. "Charlotte, can we please talk? I'm worried about you. It's been 10 days. I think we owe each other more than radio silence." Kelly started asking pointed questions about my plan. "How long are you going to stay here? You can't avoid him forever." But I wasn't avoiding him. I was protecting my right to process my feelings without pressure. There's a difference, even if other people don't understand it. By the third week, I was starting to feel more clear about what I wanted to say to Ben. I missed him, but I also felt more like myself than I had in months. I wasn't constantly worried about his mood or trying to balance his needs with my responsibilities. I could just exist without having to justify my existence to anyone. I decided I'd go home at the end of the month and have the conversation we needed to have. I'd explain that I needed more independence in our relationship, that his anxiety about my career was his to manage, not mine to fix. We could work things out, but only if he could accept that I wasn't going to shrink myself to make him more comfortable. On day 28, I texted him, "I think we should talk. Can I come home tomorrow evening?" His response came back immediately, "Charlotte, I can't do this anymore." I stared at my phone, confused. Can't do what? I can't be in a relationship with someone who disappears for a month without explanation. I'm done. I called him, my heart racing. When he answered, his voice was different, flatter, more distant than I'd ever heard it. "Ben, what are you talking about? I told you I needed time to think." Time to think doesn't mean completely cutting off communication for 4 weeks. That's not taking space, Charlotte. That's abandoning the relationship. I wasn't abandoning anything. I was protecting my right to process my feelings without pressure. You're right. What about my rights? What about my need to know that the person I love is okay? What about basic human decency? I felt like the ground was shifting under me. I was giving us both space to figure things out. You were punishing me for bringing up legitimate concerns about our relationship. That's not true, isn't it? I told you I felt neglected, and your response was to neglect me completely for a month. I tried to explain my perspective, but Ben wasn't hearing me. In his mind, I'd chosen the cruelest possible response to his vulnerability. In my mind, I'd chosen the healthiest possible response to his unreasonable expectations. "I want to come home," I said. "I want to work this out." "There's nothing to work out. I've spent the last month accepting that our relationship is over." "Over? Ben, I never said I wanted to break up. You didn't have to say it, you showed me." We talked for another 20 minutes, but it was clear that we were speaking different languages. What I saw as healthy boundary setting, he saw as emotional abandonment. What he saw as expressing his needs, I saw as suffocating control. When I hung up, I felt completely disoriented. How had a month of space turned into a permanent ending? How had my attempt to save our relationship destroyed it instead? I went home the next day to collect more of my things and found that Ben had already started packing up my belongings. He was cordial but distant. Like I was an acquaintance he was helping move rather than someone he'd shared a life with for 4 years. "I don't understand how we got here," I said, standing in our living room surrounded by boxes of my books and clothes. "I think the problem is that we understand each other perfectly," Ben replied. "We just want different things." "What do I want that's so terrible?" He paused in his packing and looked at me directly. "You want to be in a relationship that doesn't require you to consider anyone else's needs. And I want to be with someone who sees me as a priority, not an obligation. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's honest." Over the following weeks, I kept waiting for Ben to reach out to realize he'd overreacted to want to try again, but he didn't. When I'd drive by our old neighborhood, I'd sometimes see his car in the driveway and resist the urge to stop. When mutual friends mentioned his name, I'd probe for information about whether he seemed sorry, whether he missed me, whether he'd indicated any regret about his decision. The answer was always no. According to everyone who saw him, Ben seemed fine. Better than fine, actually. He joined a hiking group, started taking photography classes, seemed more social and outgoing than he'd been in years. Meanwhile, I felt like I was drowning. Not because I couldn't function without him, but because I couldn't understand how someone could love you for 4 years and then write you off so completely over what I still believed was a reasonable request for space. 3 months after our last conversation, I ran into him at the grocery store. My stomach clenched when I saw him in the produce section, looking relaxed and content in a way that seemed designed to hurt me. "Hi, Charlotte." "Hi." We stood there awkwardly, both holding shopping baskets, both probably calculating the fastest route to the checkout. "How are you?" he asked, and his tone was genuinely curious, not bitter or angry. "I'm okay, how are you?" "Good, really good, actually." I wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. Did he miss me? Did he think about our relationship? Did he ever wonder if he'd made a mistake? but his demeanor suggested that he'd moved on so completely that those questions would only embarrass me. "I'm glad you're doing well," I said instead. "Thanks, I hope you are too." And that was it. 4 years reduced to pleasantries in the produce section. Walking to my car afterward, I felt something I hadn't felt since our breakup: clarity. Not the kind of clarity I'd been waiting for, where I'd suddenly understand how to fix things or win him back. But a different kind, where I began to see our relationship, and its ending, from a perspective that wasn't entirely about defending my own choices. The truth is, I had checked out of our relationship long before I moved to Kelly's. Not intentionally, and not because I didn't love Ben, but because I'd started viewing his needs as obstacles to my goals rather than legitimate concerns from someone who loved me. When he'd tried to tell me he felt neglected, I'd heard criticism instead of vulnerability. When he'd asked for more connection, I'd felt suffocated instead of loved. And when he'd needed reassurance that he mattered to me, I'd disappear completely. I'd been so focused on protecting my independence that I'd forgotten independence within a relationship looks different from independence as a single person. It doesn't mean doing whatever you want without considering your partner's feelings. It means maintaining your individual identity while choosing to prioritize the relationship you've built together. Ben wasn't trying to control me or limit my career. He was trying to save a relationship with someone who'd stopped participating in it. And instead of recognizing that, I'd punished him for caring. The month I'd spent at Kelly's hadn't been about processing my feelings or gaining clarity. It had been about avoiding the work required to balance my individual needs with our collective needs as a couple. I'd chosen the easiest option for me without considering what it cost him. I'd convinced myself that I was being mature and healthy by taking space, but I'd actually been selfish and cruel. When someone you love expresses vulnerability and asks for more connection, the loving response isn't to withdraw completely. It's to figure out how to give them what they need while still maintaining what you need. Ben had spent 4 years learning my communication style, supporting my ambitions, and adapting to my needs. When he'd finally asked me to do the same for him, I'd chosen to walk away rather than do the work. I don't think Ben was perfect in how he handled his concerns about our relationship, but I understand now that he was scared of losing me, and that fear made him more needy than usual. Instead of reassuring him or working together to find a better balance, I'd confirmed his worst fear by actually leaving. The most painful part of this realization is understanding that our breakup was preventable. If I'd stayed and had the difficult conversations Ben wanted, if I'd been willing to examine my priorities and make some adjustments, if I'd treated his concerns as legitimate rather than unreasonable, we probably could have worked things out. Instead, I'd chosen the nuclear option and then been surprised when it destroyed everything. I see now that love isn't just about finding someone who accepts you exactly as you are. It's also about being willing to grow and adapt for someone who's doing the same for you. It's about choosing the relationship over and over again, especially when that choice requires you to stretch beyond your comfort zone. I'd expected Ben to support my career unconditionally, while I remained unwilling to prioritize our relationship when it needed attention. I'd wanted the benefits of partnership without accepting the responsibilities that come with it. The hardest part is knowing that Ben is probably better off without me. Not because I'm a terrible person, but because I wasn't ready to be the kind of partner he deserved. I was too focused on protecting my independence to appreciate the interdependence that makes relationships work. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Ben had started dating someone new. A woman named Rachel who works as a teacher and seems to understand the balance between individual goals and relationship priorities in a way I never did. I felt a stab of jealousy when I heard the news, but underneath, it was something unexpected: relief. Relief that Ben had found someone who could give him what he'd needed from me. Relief that he wasn't still nursing wounds from our relationship. Relief that his capacity for love hadn't been damaged by my inability to receive it properly. I'm still single, still focused on my career, still figuring out how to be in relationship without losing myself. But I'm approaching dating differently now, with more awareness of what partnership actually requires. I'm not looking for someone who will disappear when I need space, but I'm also not looking for someone who will tolerate being ignored when they need connection. I want to find someone I'm willing to choose every day, especially on the days when choosing them requires me to be better than I was the day before. Ben taught me that love isn't a feeling you fall into and hope sustains itself. It's a practice, a skill, a series of choices you make, even when those choices are uncomfortable or inconvenient. I wish I'd learned that lesson while we were still together. But I'm grateful I learned it at all, even if the cost was losing someone I truly loved. The most honest thing I can say about our relationship is this: Ben deserved better than what I was able to give him, and I deserved the consequences of that failure. Not because I'm a bad person, but because I made selfish choices and then convinced myself they were healthy ones. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go find the love they deserve from someone who's ready to give it, even when that someone isn't you.